All right, welcome back to the conversation, everybody. If you haven't heard, there's a really interesting show on Netflix. It's called The Innocence Files, and you've now seen probably a couple of shows that show you stories where, oh, it turns out the person who you thought did it didn't actually do it. Well, this does this on a grand scale. It's got 9 episodes, and it shows you folks who were on death row, for example, who it turns out were completely innocent. And Netflix did this with the Innocence Project. And we're lucky here because we now have Vanessa Potkin and Peter Neufeld from the Innocence Project with us. Peter's actually one of the co-founders of the Innocence Project, and Vanessa is their director of post-conviction litigation over there, which is the main thing that they do. So it's great to have you both here. I want to ask you about the show, and obviously I want to ask you about the Innocence Project overall. So a funny question that doesn't have anything to do with justice to begin with, but how did you guys wind up working with Netflix to get this show on the air? You've been doing this a long, long time. Peter, you started this back in '92, right? So how did this particular show come about?
So, we've been hit by producers for years with different ideas for shows, but they were always wrong. And then a few years ago, Ari Emanuel approached us with an idea and said that he would make sure there'd be a show where we could show the themes in an important way and get good directors. And we said, okay. And then he basically introduced us to Netflix, and the Netflix documentary team has been just outstanding. And they gave us the ability to select the themes, to work with them on picking the directors. The directors work with us in picking the cases. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful relationship, and we're very grateful.
Yeah. And we've talked to some of the directors that you had on these episodes before. Some of the best names there are in filmmaking. Alex Gibney, Andy Grebe was on recently talking about one of the episodes. So Vanessa, though, this give people a sense of context here. I want to talk about how you get them off in a second, but how many folks have been wrongly convicted that you guys helped to set free?
So throughout the country, there have been over 350 people proven innocent with DNA testing. And when you take into consideration all the different types of new evidence that can be used to exonerate people, over 2,500 people have been proven innocent after wrongful conviction. And of the DNA cases, the Innocence Project has played a role in, over 150 of those cases. And we've also exonerated many people with non-DNA forms of evidence.
How many people on death row?
So overall, there have been, just about 20 people who have walked off of death row after being proven innocent with DNA evidence.
And so we were going to kill them, and it turns out they were not the right people.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that you'll see in this series is that, you would think that if somebody was going to be prosecuted for capital murder and sentenced to death, it would be a case that had ironclad evidence. And that's just not the case. There are many people sitting on death row today who were convicted based on, very flimsy evidence, based on faulty forensics, evidence that we now know, like the bite mark comparison evidence, at issue in the case of Kennedy Brewer and Lavon Brooks featured, just evidence that has been totally discredited and is unreliable. Yet there are still people facing execution today. We represent one of them, a man named Eddie Lee Howard in Mississippi, based on this same evidence, and he's facing execution today. So the problem persists.
Right. Peter, it's funny you say in the first episode that after you started the Innocence Project, ironically, you lost a little bit of faith in the American criminal justice system. Why is that?
Well, for instance, I started out as a public defender. And when I was a public defender, if I had heard that my client had confessed, I thought that was the end of the case, and I had to quickly try and work out a plea bargain. Now we find out that 25% of our exonerations are comprised of people who falsely confessed. I had been in a lot of cases where an eyewitness would point at the client and say, as God is my witness, I'll never forget that person as long as I live. And that sounded pretty compelling. And now we know in 70% of our cases that those were unreliable identifications and they were wrong. So all these different things that we believed in for so long as the linchpins of criminal justice turn out to be unreliable, turn out to be inaccurate. Experts lie, experts distort the evidence. Witnesses are mistaken, police engage in misconduct, prosecutors want to win at any cost. So I didn't know that 30 years ago. I know that now.
So, Peter, why do people confess when they didn't do it?
Boy, is that a good question, because I think of all the causes of wrongful conviction, that's probably the most counterintuitive. I mean, we all like to think that I would never admit to something I didn't do unless they put a gun to my head. But it turns out that a lot of people get incredibly stressed out during these lengthy interrogations. The police are accusatory. They're threatening violence, even if they're not using violence. They're telling people if they just say what the cop wants to hear, they can go home, which they can't. And finally, people just say, okay, I'll give them what they want. I know I'm innocent, and I'll never be convicted of this because there's no other evidence. Well, they're wrong. They get convicted just based on the confession.
Right. And Vanessa, how much does race play a role in these convictions, especially vis-a-vis class? Because we know that if you're wealthy, you're going to be able to lawyer up and have a much, much better defense. Everybody knows that. Even the Republicans know that. Everybody knows it. But so there's class and there's race. I don't know that you can tell what's more important, but some people are still skeptical that race is a factor, although even if they might acknowledge classes.
Well, we know that, race is a huge factor in the criminal justice system. I mean, just yesterday, or recently, the Supreme Court struck down the use of non-unanimous jury verdicts in Louisiana as unconstitutional and, violating a fair right to a trial. And the whole origin of non-unanimous jury verdicts and why they exist in Louisiana and still, up until just a couple of days ago in Oregon, was to dilute the Black vote of jurors. And so, it had very racist origins. And so, for something like that might not be at the forefront to just looking at, who is, being targeted by our criminal justice system, where are we policing, what kind of implicit bias comes into play in the investigations of, crimes, what rushes to judgment about criminality come to the forefront. So, the entire criminal justice system disproportionately impacts people of color, the war on drugs, and so too does it when we look at wrongful convictions. And yes, class is huge. I mean, we have a crisis of indigent defense in this country. We have public defenders who, handle hundreds of cases, who spend an average of, 7 minutes on cases. They're pled out, and they're not really investigated because the public defender system, the resources just aren't there. And so just take somebody like Kennedy Brewer, who, is in the series, the Netflix series, in the early 90s, he lived in a house where there was no running water, right? And the state of Mississippi decides that he committed a crime and they're prosecuting him. And they have all the resources of the state, the district attorney's office. They can call in the FBI, the Mississippi Highway Patrol, and what does he have? He has appointed counsel and who, is overtaxed and not really able to provide him the type of defense that, we would want if we were fighting for our lives.
The Justice Department had kept data for a long time on rapes in America. And most rapes in America are committed within a race. Black men raping black women, white men raping white women. And it's only about 11% of the rapes are cross-racial. Unlike that number of 11%, 55% of our clients were black men wrongfully convicted of sexually assaulting and killing white women. was 5 times what it should be.
Wow.
Not only are black people more often wrongfully convicted than white people, but horribly, it actually takes the Innocence Projects and the other members of the network, on average, 4 years longer for us to exonerate somebody who was African American than to exonerate someone who was white. That the courts are more resistant, the cops are more resistant, there are more misidentifications, false confessions, jailhouse informants, you name it. More factors come into play with our black clients than our white clients. So we see racism in every aspect of our work.
You guys make a big difference. Everybody check out the Innocence Files on Netflix. But Vanessa and Peter, you're doing God's work. And if you don't believe in that, at least you're doing justice's work. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you for inviting us.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcasts.